Okay, let's slowly start. So just to give you a bit of background, I'm Sevjan. I'm the Marketing Executive for Knowledge Train. Knowledge Train and Agile KRC are in partnership. Today we have Barbara with us, so thanks so much for joining. This webinar is recorded, so after the webinar, probably next week, you will receive the recording as well as the PDF version of the PowerPoint. Right at the end, we will have a Q&A session. So if you do have any questions, you can always jot them down or pop them in the chat and we'll go over them right at the end. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sev. So hello and thanks everybody for joining this session. It's lovely for me to get the opportunity to talk about the two things I'm very keen on. One is Agile, obviously, and the other one is estimating. It's one of these things that everybody assumes people should know how to do, but nobody ever teaches you. So basically what I wanted to do with this session is talk about how estimation actually works. And if you're wondering why me, basically I've been around doing Agile for forever, since we decided before it was called Agile. I worked on rapid application development. I've been involved with Agile a lot, and basically I help organizations transform to Agile. So I specialize in the complex corporate world. But I always believe, and I keep telling people, that Agile is a lot about common sense and it's about being pragmatic. It's not about following a rule book. And I'm lucky enough to get invited to talk all around the world in the last 3 years, mostly from home, but before that, traveling around the world to talk about Agile. So apart from an awful lot of experience of doing Agile in the complex world, I'm actually, unusually, I'm a fully trained estimator as well. So many years ago, I was trained as an estimator for the purposes of putting together commercial bids. So it's quite an unusual combination of skills. I think not many people can say they're trained as estimators. So what I want to talk about today is when you're estimating, how do you do the estimation? How does it work in an Agile environment? What's different about estimating in an Agile environment to a traditional environment? And talking a little bit about the one thing estimators have to deal with is people want accurate estimates and there's stuff you don't know. And how do you balance the uncertainty and risk? How do you make the two work together? And then I wanted to talk about how you choose the right estimating style. So whether that's who, why, when, how across a project lifecycle. So first of all, why do we estimate? Well, normally you do it for two reasons. Either you want to work out what it's going to cost to deliver something specific, or sometimes we do it the other way around, which is I've got this budget, what can I get for my budget? Either of them are absolutely fine. There are times when you don't need to estimate at work. If somebody says you've got free time, there's no constraints, just get on with this work, and I'm not worried about the cost or the timeframes, then actually sometimes you don't need to create an estimate. But in the normal commercial world, somebody wants to know either what they're going to get or what it's going to cost to get a result. So those are typically the two reasons. So first of all, when we estimate, you want to understand what. So what am I going to get for my money? Or what is it we're trying to do? So using the user story format, as Barbara, I need transport to the office so that I can facilitate a workshop. So that's the first question. I, as the user, want to know what's the estimate for doing that? So the first question somebody's going to say to me is, how good does it need to be? And obviously, if you ask me, I'd rather have a Porsche, but if I'm on a limited budget, it might be that I hire a moped. It depends how good the solution needs to be. Then I need to understand how much is this going to cost. So, well, yes, you can have a Porsche, it'll cost you X £1,000 a day, a lot of insurance, and it'll cost you a lot to drive into London. Alternative, if you hire a scooter, that's going to be much cheaper. And then finally, typically people want to know when they're going to get this solution. So these are the things that you're juggling with when you're asked to create an estimate. What am I going to get? How good's it got to be? How much have I got to spend? And when is it needed for? So as an estimator, these are often the questions you have to ask. And the reason we create estimates is we need to support things like the commercial understanding and the business case. We need to do forward planning, and we need to do some decision making. So quite often my estimate will result in somebody saying, you must be joking, I can't afford that, or that looks a bargain, I'll have two. Or working out if that's what it's going to cost, if that's how long it's going to take, when am I going to get it? So basically the estimating is a support mechanism. It's not the end goal in itself. It's to support other things happening. And what we need to do when we're estimating is make sure that we provide the right level of detail and no more for use in each circumstance. So not everything, not low-level detail. We can't produce detailed, precise estimates in the early stages of something if we don't know much about it. And I often use analogies. So when we were looking to do an extension at home, we were saying, well, roughly how much have we got to spend? And based on that, roughly, very roughly, what could we get for our money? But it was only later that we had to go into more detail. So it's the right level of detail and no more for each circumstance. So if we're estimating for Agile, then we need to take a slightly different approach, because if you work in a traditional waterfall type environment, basically you fix time, you fix features, you say you're fixing time, you say you're fixing cost, and often one of them has to give. And if you don't fix the ones on the outside, then quality is compromised. But typically on a traditional project, waterfall project, it's usually time that slips. What we do in Agile is we turn things upside down, and fairly early on in a project, we fix time, we fix cost, we fix quality, and what we allow to vary is features. So you won't get everything in an Agile project if we hit problems. The first thing we do is we drop the most important feature so that we can still deliver on time. So that's our working premise. So in order for that to work, we need to create different plans at different stages. And what I do is we talk about horizons, and I'll explain these in a bit more detail later, but I use analogies, examples to make you think, what does the horizon look like? So basically the horizons you work to are a telescope view, the big picture stuff, a binoculars view coming closer to you, a magnifying glass quite close, and a microscope very detailed. Those are the four sort of levels of estimating that you have to create in an Agile project. So typically you would use a different style of estimating depending on which of those views, which of those horizons you're working to. And basically, the way we work in Agile is that you're building a solution based around iterative development and incremental testing. And what that means is you get frequent validation of your estimate in these short feedback loops. So on a traditional project, you estimate at the beginning, and quite often you're not there at the end, and you never learn how good or bad your estimating is. On an Agile project, you learn all the time. So if you're estimating for a sprint, at the end of that sprint, 2 to 4 weeks, you'll know how good your estimates were, or what did you miss. You'll know if you're a pessimistic or an optimistic estimator. So you've got this feedback process into the estimating in Agile that actually makes people become better and more confident estimators based on what they've done, what they've learned, and how they can make it better next time. So one of the important things working as an estimator is to understand some basic rules. And as far as I'm concerned, there is one rule that you need to accept. And once you've got this one in your head, life gets a lot easier. And it's a very, very simple rule. And the rule is that basically an estimate is always wrong, or almost always wrong. And this is perfectly normal, and it's to be expected. When I'm coaching teams, if my team are constantly delivering exactly on their estimates every time, then my perception is they're overestimating to be comfortable. Whereas in reality, it is highly unlikely that your estimates will be spot on every time. They're nearly always wrong because life isn't quite how you expect it to be. There are things that will happen that will affect your estimates. Some of them you could have controlled, some of them are outside your control. So once you learn or you accept that an estimate is almost always wrong, then life gets a bit easier. So there's a misconception, sometimes coming up from above, that I want a 100% accurate estimate, and people think if you spend enough time on that estimate, it will be 100% accurate. This really, really is a misconception, that you simply can't deliver a perfect estimate. You simply can't. The reality is that even an estimate for the next 10 minutes can be wrong. How many of you have been working on something, you're trying to get it finished, and there's a fire drill? Or your boss calls you in and says, could you just do this? The unexpected, the unplanned is always a possibility. There's a technical term for this. It's called stuff happens. And stuff happens all the time. That's the polite version. There's always going to be uncertainty until you've done. So at 5 minutes to midnight on the perfect project, you can have a power outage and everything goes pear-shaped. So accept that there is uncertainty, there always will be, and you cannot be perfect, and it's not something you should try and achieve. So it's the right level for the right point in time. And if you're pushed to give perfection, you have to explain that that just can't be 100% accurate. So what we need to do is understand fairly early on why we're trying to do this estimate, because the purpose for the estimate will drive how long we spend on it. So we need to do just enough to meet the purpose at this time, not loads and loads of effort to produce a very detailed estimate for a no-go decision early on in a project. We need to know some rough sizings. If we spend about that much and we get about that much value, does that sort of make sense? And if people go, well, it looks okay so far, good. If they say, you must be joking, then it might be we kill the project there, which is good commercial decision making. So early on in the project, what we need to do is not waste time chasing detail that doesn't exist yet. So on a traditional project, we're used to trying to pin all the detail down. In an Agile project, we don't want to do that. So in the early stages of an Agile project, first thing we need to understand is what are the key cost and business drivers for this project? Do we understand what they are? So what are the business initiatives? What are the business reasoning behind it? Are there any constraints of cost? Is it as much money as you want, which is unlikely? Are there time constraints, or is there a budget that we're working to? Because that will affect the way we do the estimating. And secondly, early on, it's not helpful to take ages to provide this very, very detailed estimate. It might look precise, but in reality, it will prove to be inaccurate, even though you've spent 3 months trying to produce the perfect estimate. You'd have been better spending a week maybe on it and then get on with the work. So often in a project, it's much more valuable to produce a rough estimate very early on. So what we've also found, people have done studies on estimating, and they've found that the time spent in estimating very soon reaches a point where the extra effort you're putting in doesn't prove any particular improvement in accuracy. It's as good as it's going to get fairly early on in the project when you don't know a lot about the detail, and that's absolutely fine, and that's perfectly normal. So what we can see is that when you're working in a project concept, you've got these 4 horizons. You've got the telescope, you've got the binoculars, you've got the magnifying glass, you've got the microscope. And basically the estimating and the planning is based around these horizons, these time frames. And depending on the horizon, the time frame, it will depend the style of estimating and the style of planning you use. So we do not want detailed estimates and detailed plans right early on in a project, because there's stuff we don't know. And we're not going to know it at this stage. It's going to come out later. So the low-level detail of some of the functionality, we don't know it yet, but we know enough to say that functionality is about medium size, or that's actually a small piece of work, or that's a horrendous piece of work. We might need to think carefully about that one. So there's this intrinsic link between uncertainty and horizons. So what we know is when you're working to a big distant horizon, there's a lot more uncertainty. So let's say I've decided to sail from Dover to the Bahamas. Would be nice. Quite like that idea. If I was trying to plan that in detail, there's no point. So I can work out waypoints, but I can't tell you that in 2.5 weeks' time at 3:30 in the afternoon, I'll be at this point in the Atlantic or the Pacific or whichever way I'm sailing. So when we're working to big horizons, the confidence will naturally be lower and therefore the accuracy will be lower. So for example, if you ask me to create my predictions for 2024, they will be very much best guesses. And I think a lot of us learned that over COVID. I was due to spend the first 6 months of 2020. I was booked in to travel all over the world talking Agile. I got as far as Chicago, COVID hit, I got home before they closed all the airports down, and from that point on, I didn't do the travelling, I did the work I needed to do, but I did it from home. So we've learned that it's very, very difficult to confidently predict the future because COVID proved that almost decisions were made day to day because you were being hit with things you weren't expecting, and that's perfectly normal. But if you're working to a smaller horizon, if you're working on something that's nearer to you, we know more about that and therefore we make less assumptions. So my confidence will be higher, my estimates will be more accurate if you ask me what I think I can get done in the next 2 weeks. Right, so the next 2 weeks I'm out on Wednesday, so that will give me 9 working days. If I based on the assumption that I do about 6 working hours in a 7-hour day, I can get about 9 times 6, about 54 working hours worth of work in, and I can plan that in more detail. If I'm looking for a horizon that's 3 months, 6 months, a year, I can't and won't plan to that level of detail because there's much more uncertainty. So accepting that it, depending on where you are, depends on the style, depends on the uncertainty, depends on the planning style. They're all very closely linked together. So make sure that the style of estimating matches the level of uncertainty. Don't try and mismatch precise estimating with a lot of uncertainty because it's a waste of time. And you can't pin the detail down up front in an agile project because that's not what we do. We accept that life is volatile, so we try to defer decisions until the last possible safe moment. That's exactly why. So, as I said before, we've got these 4 horizons for Agile. We've got the long-term horizon, the big picture. So if we're looking at the big picture, we're looking at life through a telescope. We've got limited knowledge, limited detail. Our confidence is low. If I'm going to drive from here to Scotland, basically I need some high-level maps. I don't want the very, very low-level street map of Edinburgh at the moment. I might need it later, but I don't need it at the moment. So that would relate to, for example, a whole project, the full delivery of a piece of work. There's a lot more uncertainty. It's a big picture. It's a bit blurred around the edges, but I've got a rough idea of what I need to do. If we look at the next one, the medium-term horizon, so this is our binoculars, we've got better knowledge because it's a subset of the big picture. So I can focus in on this first subset that I'm going to work on. And that might be the current or the next increment or release or the next intermediate delivery. So I can now afford to sort of change my magnification and focus in closer on a smaller part of the map now. So I'll explore that and make it bigger and get more detail on this next one, this medium horizon. So it's binocular level. Going to the next horizon again, the short-term horizon, we've got good knowledge, we've got good confidence. So this would relate to things like estimating and planning for the sprint we're about to work on. So if we assume that best guidance for sprints will be 2 to 4 weeks, we as a team can plan what we're going to do for the next 2 to 4 weeks based on we've worked out who's got holidays, how much time people have got available. Everybody's looking fit and healthy at the moment. That could change obviously, but at the moment it looks like we've got a full team for the full 2 weeks. This is the amount of work we think we can fit in. So quite a lot of confidence, still a little bit of unknown. Fred apparently is sneezing yesterday. We're hoping it's hay fever, but if he's coming down with a cold, we could be in trouble here. So that's the short-term horizon, more confidence, more knowledge, better estimates, more precise estimates. And then the final horizon is the immediate horizon. So that's the very detailed knowledge where we're highly confident. And that would be, for example, at the daily scrum, the daily stand-up, when I'm telling you what I'm planning to do in the next 24 hours. And based on, I know how I feel well, I'm expecting not to be interrupted. In fact, I'm working from home and I'm going to switch the phone off so I know that I'm going to be able to give my full attention to my work. So unless we have an alarm goes off in the house, I can dedicate my time. So different horizons, different levels of confidence, different styles of estimating, but always accepting, even in all those four, that stuff can happen to any of them. You can be working in the office, there's a fire drill, you've done your daily scrum, what you're going to do today, and you basically have to file out, stand in the rain for 20 minutes and then walk up 7 flights of stairs, and there's an hour gone. Stuff happens, and it's not somebody's fault, it's just life. So that's balancing the horizons, the confidence and the uncertainty. But what we also have to deal with is the unknown, and this is where people get very uncomfortable, because they feel they should know. And if they don't know, why don't they know? And management sometimes say, well, you should know. I want a precise estimate. And sometimes you need to have the confidence to say, you know what, I'm not sure, but I've got a way of dealing with it. And the way we deal with the unknown is, as an estimator, you make an assumption. And we all do this anyway, but what you do as an estimator is you make this very, very visible. So based on the assumption that everybody is committing to this fully and they're doing a normal day's work, this is what we think we're going to get done. So assumptions are absolutely invaluable for the estimator. We make them in our head, but in our estimates, we actually need to make them written down. So, for example, I did a big estimate for a big piece of work for a large customer. And one of the assumptions that nobody wrote down was that we would have a test environment in place on day one. I said, well, okay, that's fine, but it's not there now, so you need to write that down. So we wrote down against our estimate, based on the assumption that the test environment will be in place on day one, this is what we think we can do. Interestingly, it wasn't delivered for about 2 months. And when people said, well, it's your fault, your estimate was rubbish, we could say, no, I'm sorry. You saw the estimate, you said that would be delivered. It wasn't delivered. It was an absolute blocker for us. And that's why we have problems. So what we need to do is use assumptions to make informed guesses about any factors that might influence our estimate. So we're estimating for time and money. What are the things that realistically might hit that could cause us problems? So for example, I'm doing an estimate in the early stages, assuming that I've got a team that have worked on this particular software before, are skilled at it, and aren't going through a steep learning curve. If you give me a team of people who've just joined the company this week and haven't done their training yet, then my estimate's going to be wrong. So I make these assumptions and they will affect the time or the money that I'm estimating. And basically I write them down very, very clearly, assumption 1, assumption 2, assumption 3. And then very, very importantly, I need to make sure that they are absolutely linked together and they can't be separated. So you can't have the estimate without the assumptions, because if you can't see the assumptions, you've no idea whether it's based on quicksand or concrete. And in my experience, when an estimate is wrong, it is nearly always because one of the assumptions was wrong or misguided or needed revisiting. And in the early stages, if you're finding problems, go back to your assumptions, challenge your assumptions. So we talk about challenging estimates. And I'm sure you've all been in the situation where you do an estimate and somebody says, well, I don't like your figures. Could you give me a smaller number? And the answer to that is, yes, of course, what would you like to drop? But that's quite difficult when it's a senior manager. But what we say to people is you can't say that's too much time or that's too much money. What you can do is say, can you explain to me assumption 1? You've said, assuming we have a team who's skilled to do this, how confident are you that we're going to get the right people? Because if that's unlikely, then we're going to have to up the estimate. So we're more likely to talk about the assumptions than the physical numbers that we're talking about. So the assumptions and the estimate must be literally chained or stapled together so they don't get separated. And what you find is the assumptions are very closely associated with risks. So if you've got a big assumption, then that equates to a big risk. So basically, any estimate that's got a very, very big assumption on it, you may want to explore that assumption to find out whether it's true or false. Because if the assumption proves false and it's a big risk, then that could be a stopper for your project. So an invalid assumption can significantly affect an estimate, can significantly affect whether a piece of work should go forward or not. For example, we often do analogy estimating. So we've got a new piece of software, and I've been told that this is very similar to a piece of software that we're already familiar with. So I would make that assumption based on X is similar to Y, and we know Y, it's about this big. But what we then typically do is we take the new software and we do some sort of proof of concept to check whether my assumption is right or not. And that is a normal part of estimating, to sort of validate the assumptions. So validate the major assumptions as soon as is practical. And apart from anything else, this is good practice for dealing with risk. If you've got a big risk, you don't put your fingers in your ears, shut your eyes and hope that it's going to work out. If you've got a big risk or a big assumption, look at it sooner. Check it out. Don't just say, oh, I'll accept that and see what happens later. And this also aligns very, very clearly with Agile's fail fast approach. And when I'm talking to people about Agile, they often pick this up and say, no, you're Agile, you just want to fail. No, I don't want to fail. All I'm saying is if you're going to fail as early as you can so that it's cheaper, quicker to fix it, or you haven't thrown away a lot of money. So if you're going to fail, find out as early as possible when you've got more decisions. If you fail at 5 minutes to midnight, there is very, very little you can do to fix things because it's almost too late and you've got no choices. So an example, you might identify a risk, and to address that risk, you might say, right, we're going to do a proof of concept or some sort of architectural spike that might be critical as part of your feasibility or foundations to support a go, no-go decision on this whole piece of work. So spend a little to either save a fortune or feel a bit more comfortable to move forward. And just a top tip from me as an estimator doing big, complex commercial estimates, I always present my assumptions before I give anybody the figures. So basically, people understand that these are the assumptions. Based on these assumptions, these are the figures. So it highlights that the assumptions are the foundations for the estimate, not an afterthought. And that's really, really important. So sometimes people have a habit of taking the bits out of an estimate they like. You quote a range and they quote you the lowest end of the range instead of the whole range. So make sure they stay closely linked, the assumptions and the estimates. So give you a very, very simple everyday example. So I'm chatting to somebody at work and I've told them I've got to be in Manchester tomorrow and I reckon I can do it in about 4 hours. And if I say, okay, it's going to take me about 4 hours to drive to Manchester, I'll get one of three answers. It will be, okay, thanks for that, or that seems a long time, or that seems quite quick, because I've given very little information, so I got very simple answers back. If we state the assumptions against this, which were actually in my head, but I didn't make them explicit, so I can drive from London to Manchester in about 4 hours, assuming I can use the motorway. There are no major hold-ups. I avoid rush hour and I keep to the speed limit. They're sort of in my head, but now I'm making them visible. That gives me a more intelligent conversation because people will then come back and say, okay, so you're going to avoid the rush hour? Can you avoid the rush hour if you need to arrive between 5 and 6? And what about those long-running roadworks on the M6? Will they be finished by then? So my assumptions lead to better conversations. That's why they need to be visible and that's why they need to be discussed. Because it could be that somebody knows the long-running roadworks are running on longer than expected and I didn't know that. So it's perfectly normal and valid to talk about the assumptions and if necessary amend them. That's all part of estimating. It's not a question of your competence. So the other thing we have to think about is when we do an estimate, we need to present the estimate in a way that reflects my confidence in the figures. because sometimes it's a finger in the air, best guess on smoke mirrors and a little bit of vaguely previous experience. Certainly, any early estimates will have uncertainty, and I need people to understand right from the start that if it's an early estimate, there are a lot of unknowns, and therefore my confidence in this is probably not even medium. It's probably low, or even tinging on the red. I might need to do an investigation before I can even give you some figures. So the estimate that we create as estimators is to support decisions by the business. And this is often misunderstood. There is often a lot of pressure put on the estimator to create estimates that look nice, the sort of figures that the business want to receive. What we estimate should be realistic based on our level of uncertainty and the risks, i.e. the probability and the impact of the risks that we've highlighted in the assumptions. What you can't do as an estimator is own those risks. So I always talk about on a project, the risks to the project sit with the business. So I can't decide how risky the business wants to be. It's not my role. I'm not senior enough. I don't have enough clout to make those decisions. So I worked for a company when I was doing commercial estimating, and we did a risk assessment, and I could decide whether a piece of work could go ahead to a certain level of risk, and this was done on risks and probability and impact grids. So I could decide up to about level 20. 20 to 30 had to go to my boss, and anything above 30 had to go to the CEO, because it was a big risk and there was a risk to the company, and the lower management team couldn't take on that responsibility. So the risks on an estimate do not belong to the estimator. They belong to the person that asked for the risk. We give them the information, they make the decisions. So need to think about what is driving this. So the business will think, right, this is a loss leader. Yes, it's risky, but we need to get a small foothold in the market, or we need to get out there to deal with a competitor threat. Or it might be, well, this is very risky. Do we really need this business? As an estimator, I can't decide that. You may wonder what elephants have got to do with estimating. So when I was working with Nokia, happy times spent out in Finland, freezing cold, and Cambridge and places like that. And one lunchtime, I was talking to the lady that does did the strategic estimating for Nokia for the next 3 years. So she created a 3-year plan. And I just said to her over lunch, as she do, so I'm curious, you're doing this big planning. How do you do it? And she said, well, I'll tell you this, but don't tell anyone, so you didn't hear it from me. Actually, she's not in Nokia anymore, so it doesn't matter. She said, I think about them like elephants. She said, and I think about a herd of elephants, and all I'm trying to do is very, very roughly put them in a line where I've got some big ones, I've got some small ones. Some of them are very big but very risky. They need to come to the front of the queue. Some of them are big, but we don't need to address them yet, so I put them to the back of the queue. She said, all I'm doing is very, very roughly sizing, saying, that one looks about a year. Ooh, that one I don't even know. We'd have to investigate. That's quite small. That's about 3 months. She said, because when they get picked up, those estimates will get looked into in more detail. Mine is just the starting point. Nobody's going to come back to me and say, well, you said it's 3 years and it took longer than that, because she said it's irrelevant by then. All you want is a rough queue of elephants. I'm giving you a rough queue of elephants of various sizes. And to me, that's a very, very good analogy, because what you need to do at that stage is do very rough estimating, and it's so vague it will get picked up later. It's not supposed to be accurate. It's just enough so that we can create something that we've got a rough idea of what the future might look like, knowing it will change. Hence the estimates. So sometimes in the early stages, I'm mentally thinking elephants. So first of all, if we estimate for the long-term horizon, the big picture, the full delivery, what we have here, if you look at it, it's a photograph of a view. There's stuff in the distance, vague and hazy. I can't see the top of. That's actually the Cheviot, I believe. I can see detail in the foreground, but I can't see the detail further out. My knowledge is limited, and my detail is very limited. and that will affect my estimates. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. I'm flagging a red, significant uncertainty. So there's going to be a lot of assumptions. I can't be precise, even though people often demand accurate estimates. I can smile sweetly and say, I'm sorry, I can't do that. It is not possible. I cannot give you that sort of estimate. So my level of confidence is low because of the uncertainty. Therefore, I can only give you a very rough, reasonable idea of what's needed, enough for big picture planning, so we can plan the route towards future position. That's all. And just to give you a very unreasonable example in my experience, when I was a manager at British Rail and we were the Agile team and we were working for commercial customers, this guy came into me and said, Barbara, I need an estimate. So basically what I need is, and he outlined 5 statements, and he said, what I'd like from you is a fixed price estimate to include 5 years support and maintenance. And he just stepped back and he was just going to leave. And I said, that's fine. I said, I can give it to you now if you like. He said, oh, that was quick. So what's it looking like? I said, well, I think it's probably going to be about £10 million. And he said, well, that seems an awful lot. And I said, that's because you don't know what you want. I don't know what you want. You're putting all the risk on me. Looking at what you roughly described, it's probably about £1 million, but I'm putting in 900% for the risk on me. Alternatively, let's talk about it a bit more, and I'm not going to talk about a fixed price for support until we've got some idea of what we're actually delivering. And we got the work. So people need to understand that we cannot give that accurate estimate, that full-on commitment to accurate detail when we simply don't know. And it's just a fact of life. So that's the long-term horizon. The next one, the medium-term horizon, is your incremental release planning. So I'm now focusing on an element of this piece of work. So I'm now going to focus on the new customers bit of this new piece of work that we're developing. So the view is now clearer because I can take all the other stuff away and focus on new customers only. That's great. So it makes more sense. So I've got better knowledge of this because basically we've got more detail available. So yes, I'm still making assumptions, but they're not so critical because the time frame is smaller. So there's still uncertainty, but I know more about what I'm trying to do now because I've pinned it down to the next level of detail. So my confidence is improving compared to the long-term horizon. You're going to get better figures from me, enough to plan the increment, the release, and what will fit in that roughly. So I've got enough now to plan the delivery of the increment. In other words, how long, how many sprints, roughly, possibly what the sprint objectives are going to be, but I still don't have the low-level detail. Perfectly normal for Agile. We don't want to know yet the low-level detail. For Agile, we want the low-level detail about 5 minutes before you need it, because that's the last point when you can pin it down and it's going to be as accurate as it can possibly be. So that's the medium term. Short-term horizon. So this is a very clear view of what's close to us, and it is all becoming clear. So this is, for example, planning for a sprint. I've got a good knowledge now of what the low-level detail is. We've got detailed stories, requirements that we're going to take on. We know what tasks we're going to need to do to deliver those stories, those requirements. So any assumptions here are minor, based on the assumption that the network doesn't keep going down this week like it did last week. We know what we have to do. We know how we're going to do it. So pretty good estimating. Therefore, we've got high confidence because we know what we're going to do and how we're going to do it and who's going to do it potentially. So we've got enough knowledge now to plan the next 2 to 4 weeks with a reasonable level of confidence. There's still a little bit of uncertainty, but there's less compared to the release, compared to the big project picture. And then the immediate horizon, the next 24 hours, this is what we're planning at the daily scrum, the daily stand-up. So we've now got a very, very clear idea of what's in front of us directly. So we are talking about what I'm going to do in the next 24 hours based on, I know I'm feeling good, my desk is clear, I've got no other interruptions, nobody needs me today, I know what I can do, I know what I'm capable of, I know exactly what I intend to do, so that's what I'm committing to. So my confidence level is very high. The only thing I need to think about is the unexpected. So I can plan what I'm going to do today, but I can't predict fire drills. I can't predict the boss asking me, could I just do something for him? Could I fix something? I can't predict the stuff happens. So it's still possible even in a 24-hour horizon, but it's a lot more accurate than my project view. So what we can do is we look at the project lifecycle, and we can link confidence and uncertainty across a project context. So if we look at a project in terms of 4 stages, we've got the rough ideas, the very early thinking. We've got the work on the planning for iterative development. So what are my building blocks? What are the basics I'm working to? We've got the iterative development. So we've got the building blocks where we're actually creating elements of the solution. And we've got the deployment part of it where we're releasing elements of the solution, whether we're releasing them as a series of incremental releases or whether we're doing a big bang release at the end. It doesn't actually matter at this stage. So if we look at that as a basic project, what we can say is that in the early stages, our level of confidence, level of unknowns will decrease. In the very early stages, there's a lot we don't know. Once we get towards deployment, we know just about everything. The uncertainty is much, much lower. By comparison, working in parallel, our confidence, our estimate accuracy increases across the life cycle. So as one goes down, the other goes up, and they're very closely related. So if we're doing an estimate in the very early stages, lots of unknown, therefore we cannot be accurate. If we're planning, we know more, but we still have quite a lot of uncertainty. If we're planning to do a release and it's sort of the day before the release is going live, then we know an awful lot and the uncertainty is much smaller. So that helps put the whole thing into context. So if we put on there, we have the telescope, we've got the binoculars, we've got the sprint, the magnifying glass in there, and we've got the daily scrum, the microscope. That is exactly how those horizons fit across a project context. And in the same way, the style of estimating we use across the life cycle depends on what we're trying to do. So we talked about understand what you're trying to do. So in the very early stages, the very early thinking, all we're trying to do at that stage is support early decision making. So for example, coming up to we know a little bit about this, we've got a rough idea of cost, a rough idea of time. Is it a go or a no-go? Should we spend more money on this or should we quietly bury it now? So what we do there, and what we can only do there, is some sort of top-down estimating, typically by analogy. If we're going to do an extension, we know roughly that to build X number of square feet, it will, for a single story building, it costs about that much. So if we're going to build, I don't know, 100 square feet, then it's going to cost us about that much, very roughly. It doesn't take into account a gold-plated jacuzzi bath or stonemasons sort of stone walling. It's a basic model, but it's enough to say, can we afford to do something or not? When we move on to the next stage, which in Agile PM terms would be feasibility and would be foundations, we want to create plans now. So what we're trying to do is create some more sensible high-level plans. What would the overarching view of the project look like, and potentially how many releases do we think we might split it up into? Again here, because there's a lot of uncertainty still, we can do top-down estimating. So we group things by similarity, or we use analogy. Well, that looks roughly like one of those. So here we can use groupings, whether they're t-shirts or story points, work nicely here. But we can't do bottom-up estimating where we break it down and work out that that's 5 minutes, that's 10 minutes, that's 15 minutes, and you add it up. That doesn't work. It takes too long. You don't have the details, so it has to be top-down here. When we move into iterative development, we're trying to do here 2 levels of things. So first of all, what we're trying to do all the time is we're going to prepare for what's coming next. So first of all, if we're working in increment 1, we are trying to also rough size increment 2. And if we're working on sprint 1, we're trying to rough size sprint 2. So when you're doing planning ahead, we do top-down story point estimating to prepare for the sprint planning session to make sure we've got enough stories or requirements ready when we go into sprint planning. And we also do top-down estimating, typically story points, to roughly size things when we're working out what might go into the next increment. So that's the preparing for the next steps. But what we also need to do in this iterative development cycle is do the task planning for the next sprint and for deployment. So when we're doing the task planning for the sprint, what we want to do is do it as accurately as possible. And for that reason, we would normally do bottom-up estimating here, because story points are not detailed enough, they're not accurate enough. And if you burn down story points, you're burned down as flatline drop, flatline drop. We know what we're going to do. We know the tasks we're going to do. We know how long it's going to take. So if I'm a developer, I say, right, for this story, I've got to create a screen, create some test data, create a table. I'm going to have to do the coding. I'm going to have to do the testing, 5 hours, 2 hours, 3 hours, 7 hours, 1 hour, whatever. And I can add those up. And I can do that accurately because it's small and it's close to me. Similarly here, when you're planning for deployment, you plan for the tasks you need to do. Right, to deploy this, I'm going to have to run the whole test suite again, flag up that there's no critical errors, do the performance testing. I've got to go and have a review with the deployment manager to reassure him or her that this is safe to go live, and then we can just hand it over. So because it's small, because it's close, because there's less uncertainty, we can do that. So that's how we do it. And finally, just to think about things to consider when you're estimating. And I love this. This was some information from Donald Rumsfeld, who was the former US Secretary of State. And basically what he said, there are known knowns. In other words, there are always things that we know. So the example here is if we know the height of a building, and if we know how far we are away from the building, we can do the calculations and work out certain information. So if you can measure sort of at 3 feet, then you can work out exactly how high the building is. There is maths, there is stuff in place that we can do that. So if we've got known knowns, we can estimate. Easy. Life is good. Life is simple. We can give you a good estimate for that based on what we know. So if I'm estimating what I'm going to do a particular piece that is my job as a developer, it's a known known. I know what needs to be done, so I can give you estimates. But there are also going to be what we talk about as known unknowns. That's to say, we know there are some things we don't know. That is always going to be the case. So what do we do about them? We can make an assumption. We might want to do an investigation, but we need to do something to deal with the unknowns. So if it's something we know we don't know, let's go and find out. So typically what we need to do with those is we need to investigate and then estimate. And then finally, there are what we talk about as unknown unknowns. What I love is sometimes people estimate and they do risks, and they do a risk assessment based on what we talk about as black swans. You can't estimate for things that you have absolutely no idea what they are. There are things you can do. Ideally, what I would do here is I would do a sort of a risk-based estimating. And I've got examples of how that can be done. You look at your major risks, you work out if that hit, how much would it hurt us, and what is the probability of that hitting, and you do some maths and you say, right, if that could hit 10% of my costs, then I'll add on 10% into my estimate for that specific risk. And you make it very, very visible, because you can't estimate for things you don't know. So another example would be if you are doing as a supplier, if you're doing a commercial estimate for a customer and you don't know the customer and there's a lot of uncertainty, as we all know, from the supplier side, you build in contingency for your risk, which is why I quoted 10 million rather than 1, because there was a lot of risk for me and none on my customer. So that is perfectly normal. So that's my gallop through the basics of estimating. And one of the things I did during COVID, because I had time to spare, is I put together an e-learning for estimating, and this is now available. If anybody's interested in taking it, it's not expensive. It costs about the same as a book, I think. And basically, Knowledge Train are putting this up, and you can book it through them if people are interested in the full details. And it's in 7 sections, and each section has got little quizzes. It's got a sample paper, and at the end there's a multiple choice paper. And if you succeed in the multiple choice, I think it's 40%, I believe. If you succeed, you can print a certificate, say you know your stuff. If you don't succeed, you can have another go and it'll generate another paper, because for me, that gives you the opportunity to relearn or go over again or improve your score, just to show to your friends that you've got 100% if that's important to you. So that's a lot of what I talked about here is based on what's in the e-learning, the Estimating for Agile course. So that's me. How are we doing? Oh, pretty much 50 minutes, not bad. So if I said it would be about 45 to 50. So over to you guys, questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Barbara. I hope everyone learned something there. In terms of the course, I will be sending everyone an email when it is up and going. So if you, in the meantime, if you do have any questions about the course, you can always email us. You should have received an email from me yesterday and today, but just in case, I am going to write my email down. Just before we head over to the Q&A, I'm just going to give some time so people can think of questions. I'm just going to quickly pop up a survey just to get your feedback.
And I don't see this, so if you all want to say it was rubbish, that's, oh, I do see it. You better be nice to me then. It's always difficult to know what people were expecting and how much they already know as well.
So just while people answer the question, or the questionnaire, we have a question from Carl. I work in the NHS dealing with lots of projects that are subject to regulatory requirements. Would there be anything specific to consider with regards to estimation when dealing with a project subject to lots of regulation?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about regulatory anything is there's the perception that as soon as you say regulatory, it is Rolls-Royce and everything has to be done. And again, with a regulatory project, you need to understand what would meet the regulations and what would vastly exceed them. Because in my experience, so often people squeeze stuff into regulatory and say, well, if we're doing that, we're going to do a Rolls-Royce. And actually, sometimes all you need to do is enough to be good enough. So, for example, if I'm stuck in the rain, if somebody will offer me, a Vauxhall car that will get me home, I don't demand that you give me a Rolls Royce or I had a situation recently, our car broke down and the company said I had to have the same car as the one that had broken down. And they'd got I think it was a Vauxhall outside, and we sat waiting 4 hours for a car that was the same as mine, didn't have one. And eventually I said, I'm taking the Vauxhall, and that's it. It's understanding what is good enough for a regulatory project. And if you're involved in it, sometimes challenging. Don't accept it's regulatory, we need everything. We don't. People often use it to squeeze in more stuff. So what needs to be there as a bare minimum on the due date, and what is negotiable, particularly if you're trying to do Agile.
Thank you. We do have some positive comments. Interesting session, very clear. Interesting session. Great answer by Carl, so thank you. Does anyone have any more questions?
When somebody asks me something really difficult, or share something that you had a problem with. Interestingly, one of the deliberate targets of the e-learning course is not just the estimators, but the bosses. And one of the companies I've been working with, they bought 200, and it was the senior managers that went through it, as well as the teams, because I was saying to them, what you're asking is unreasonable. You need to understand why you can't ask that here, because your team's going to tell you you're not having it, and now you'll understand why. And they said they also found it very useful. So it's not just for estimators, but for recipients of estimates.
Okay,
Okay.
so yeah, can you see the
We,
questions?
we talk about Agile estimators and methodology. How does this compare to other methods? Is Agile the best? Obviously, I'm biased. Agile is the best, but it's not always the right answer. Um, I'm talking about estimating for Agile, and a lot of the techniques that I talk about in here would be equally applicable to a traditional project. So in the early stages of a traditional project, when you're still doing the early stages and the go, no-go gates, the analogy and the rough sizing is equally applicable. The horizons might be slightly different, but the style is the same. And I love Agile to death, but there are certain projects that I would not do Agile because they're not volatile enough. There's no value to doing it Agile. I'll certainly get people to use some of the Agile techniques to improve the communication and the collaboration, but I'm not one of these people that says Agile, well, you're not trying hard enough. There is a place for traditional waterfall style projects. And I was talking to a customer this afternoon. They have a lot of mainframe legacy stuff and they're working on it, and it's not suitable for Agile, and that's absolutely fine. So Agile is good at what it's good at, but it's not the answer to every problem. But the techniques here are applicable to any sort of approach. We use them at home for building projects, renovations, all sorts of things. How much we need to get done before we're going on holiday, all sorts of things. How does I couldn't read that and it disappeared. It was how does estimate class something and it disappeared. Is it possible to
Um,
go back one, Sev?
do you remember the name?
No.
No.
I'll answer Joe's then since it's on there. What techniques would Barbara advise for managing upfront cost expectations of project owners and project sponsors unfamiliar with Agile? I think it's partly explaining to them this concept of certainty, uncertainty, and how we can't do accurate. So in the early days, it's explaining I can't give you an accurate estimate because to get the detail to give you a what looks like an accurate estimate would take longer than it would do to do the work. So challenging what do you need this estimate for at this point? If it's just for a decision making point, I will give you enough information so you can make the decision as whether we stop or we move on. So I think a lot of it is educating the recipients of the estimates because they are very unreasonable. And in my experience, people come up and drop something on you and say, could you just estimate that, and your lunch break won't take long. And then they want War and Peace in microscopic detail, and it's just not fair. And I've found that when people understand more about estimates, they've got more confidence to push back and say, that is not reasonable, but what I can do is this. So you don't just refuse, but you give a helpful answer about what you could potentially do. Oh, right. Vicky, sprint carryover. Basically, there shouldn't be such a thing as automatic carryover. It should go back on the backlog to decide what to do about it. But also, if you're getting a lot of carryover, then the question to the team is, let's retrospect our estimating. So it might be, let's pick on Vicky since I can see her name and she's raised this. It might be that Vicky is the most optimistic person ever and looks at things and says, yeah, let's be about that big. Or it might be that Vicky's very pessimistic and her estimates are too big. With Agile, because you get the regular feedback, so let's say you're in sprints every 2 to 3 weeks typically, at the end of 2 to 3 weeks, you will know personally how good your estimating is. And you learn. So it's not beating people up saying your estimating is rubbish. We always turn it into a bit of a friendly team coaching session. Come on, Vicky. And when we do the sprint planning next time, we'll give you a black hat. Put this black hat on. Try to think, sometimes it's not quite so nice. Try to think less positively. Or sometimes coming up with checklists of have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? So in my experience with Agile, my teams get better and better and better because of the short feedback loops. And it makes a huge difference. So I don't know if that helps. But just beware that there shouldn't be an automatic sprint carryover, because if you do that, what you're doing is you're not reevaluating, you're just pushing and pushing stuff further away, and it will all hit you at the end anyway. Maybe it might be you've got enough now and you need to drop something and pick something else up. So it should go back onto the backlog to decide where it goes next. Oh, Vicky's still speaking to me, that's all right. So the question for you, Vicky, you have to think about, are you an optimistic or a pessimistic estimator? In my experience, testers are very good estimators because they are the world's most depressed people. They think about all the negative things that could happen, and developers are often exceedingly optimistic because they're very positive. But both sides, need to come together and understand how each other estimates.
Yep, thank you for that. Do we have another question? So the question is, how much experience do you need to be an estimator?
Um, in real life, a bit, I think. But I mean, I'm not a builder, but when we were doing the rough estimating for building here, I looked stuff up. I got some figures for, cost per square footage, or how do you estimate for a building. If you're estimating, for example, for software and building for software, then ideally it needs to be people that understand how that works, because the worst thing is an estimate by a manager for a piece of work that they know nothing about. So it might be the manager's putting the estimate together, but normally he or she would work with somebody that understands the underneath the bonnet, if you like. Project managers often estimate very optimistically because they're not dealing with the day-to-day stuff that people in the team get hit by. So you don't need to be very experienced, but you do need to know a bit of what you're talking about just for your estimates to have credence. But if it's something entirely new and nobody's ever done it before, then it has to be a stab in the dark. But people often talk about sort of, finger in the air estimating. That is actually normally based on some sort of relative experience, some sort of, you don't just say, oh, I think it's going to be about 5 weeks. You're mentally thinking in your head, well, I did something vaguely similar and it took about 3 weeks. This looks a bit more complicated, so I'll add a bit more on. So there is logic behind all of what we do.
Thank you. Another question. How does estimate class apply to the described process? Are all estimates to be considered equal, i.e. same class, or is class dependent on the horizon?
I'm not quite sure what's meant by estimate class. Do you mean the style of estimate?
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure either.
That was the one
But
I couldn't read fast enough, so
yeah.
whoever wrote that, if you could explain what you mean by estimate class. Because basically the way you estimate is driven by where you are in a life cycle and the amount of knowledge compared to uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that balance.
I don't know if they are still with us. Let me
If
just
if they're not, I'll
check.
try and, if there are any on there that I've missed, I will try and pick them up and answer them if I can. I might send them to Sev, and she can send them out to
Mhm.
everybody,
Yeah.
as long as there's not hundreds that I haven't seen.
Does anyone have any more questions? I think
Somebody's typing. Oh, James Powell is typing, so I'm hoping that James is the one that was going to explain. Two people are typing now. At least people can't see what you're typing. Oh, thank you. Oh, somebody enjoyed it. Oh, that's good. It's quite depressing that nobody's taught to estimate. I actually went through estimating training, and interestingly, I worked when the Ministry of Defence was taking bids for doing the fly-by-wire for the Eurofighter. I worked on the supplier side, and it was a consortium of 3 defence suppliers bidding to Ministry of Defence, and the bid was an agile estimate. It was an agile bid based on Agile PM, actually, and we won the bid based on agile estimates, and I was advising them on how to estimate. And it went live, it was successful, and as far as I'm aware, they've had no problems with it. So when people say agile can't do big projects and estimates need to be accurate, interestingly, this was a commercial bid and it went well. Okay, draft plans for sales. I work off a template. Um, if the template works, great. Because a template is good, it will tell you the things you need to be thinking about. So if you've got the template and it's good, great, but what I would do regularly is just look at it and say, hey guys, could this be improved? I found this is a problem. We've had problems with certain estimates. Maybe we need to add things to the template. So templates are great. Just don't switch your brain off. Don't just assume you do what the template tells you and don't think. So you can add to a template as well. Let's say you're doing a particularly unusual sales project. So you might need to do something slightly differently. It might be a new customer and there might be particular risks. So use the template as a starting point, but by all means change it or amend it. We shouldn't be driven by rules. I think rules, things like templates are there to guide you, but they shouldn't constrain you. So, for me, things like Agile PM is a guide. It's not a rule book. It helps you. It says here's a good starting point, but if you need to do it slightly differently, then do it. So you're hoping that the inheriting PM perfects and makes the plan more accurate based on further research and development. Perfect. So state your assumptions when you had your estimate over. So I've used the template. I'm assuming that you will be doing more R&D onto this so you can refine the plan. And then you are covering yourself, but explaining to your project manager that this is not intended to be a perfect one. This is a first draft for that person to refine it later. So you're stating an assumption that person might not realize. They might think it's the perfect one. And that covers all sides.
We have another question. So, what methods, fun ways would Barbara advise to make the estimating process more fun for the team? For example, planning poker or any other fun ways of estimating?
Playing poker's great fun. We were doing planning poker and we were using a boardroom that had glass doors, and the owner of the company went past and couldn't understand why the team seemed to be playing cards and having a lot of fun. I do things like when we do planning poker, I make my teams plan in fruit. Because one of the things about planning poker is a point does not equate to an hour or a day, and it can't be compared between teams. So I'll have one of my teams planning in bananas. So, if our base story is a 2-banana story, then this next one, how many bananas? So a point equates to a banana. Another team will be estimating apples. So I do silly things like that. If you're estimating a large piece of work at the early stages and you've got a lot to do, planning poker can take ages. What I put in the estimating course is the detail of affinity estimating, which is where you can do it on a floor in a room, assuming you can all get together, and it's much, much quicker to do a large volume of estimates. So that's all explained. You put a story somewhere, then you pick another one, talk about it, put it roughly where it is, and then every so often you group them, and you still end up with very, very rough planning poker groups. Please, please do not let people fill in the numbers between the Fibonacci sequence. The whole point about Fibonacci sequence is the higher the gap is because there's more uncertainty. So arguing for ages whether this is a 40 or a 38. No, if it's bigger than a 20 and smaller than 100 or an 80, then it's a 40. Because bigger estimates will get broken down later anyway. You won't take a 40-point estimate into a sprint. And when you do bottom-up estimating, if you estimate 2 5-point stories and you do bottom-up, they will look a different size. Because the top-down is the story point, which is rough sizing. The bottom-up is the most accurate, and they won't exactly map. But that doesn't matter. It's good enough. I just try and make it sort of lightweight. So again, as a coach and as a manager, I make sure that there is no blame in planning sessions. None of this. Oh, for heaven's sake, you're always overestimating. In my estimating sessions, I often make the project managers join in because I like getting them to justify why their estimates are smaller than everybody else's. Why do you think that's so simple then? I always have a rule that you are not allowed to challenge a figure. You can just challenge the estimate. But basically in a planning poker session, what you do is you do a round and you pick the highest and the lowest, and you get the highest person to explain why they think it's so big and the lowest person to explain why they think it's so simple. And usually the difference is an assumption that hasn't been stated. So the one that's very high might be saying, well, you've got all this to do. And somebody else will say, oh no, that already exists. So you then write that assumption on the story. And that is there carrying forward based on the assumption this bit is already done. We've already got a pay by credit card function ready done. It's this big. So it's this sort of fun, but make it not personal. So, you don't challenge the person, you challenge their thinking behind it. What makes you think it's so big, or why do you think it's so simple? Because the two extremes are thinking something that's different, or they both know something that us in the middle have missed. And normally it shouldn't take more than 3 rounds to come to agreement. And if, say, you're down to a mix between a 3 and a 5, just decide, at this stage, would you rather go for a slightly higher one or a slightly lower one? It's not about pinpoint accuracy. It's about, is it good enough for now? Because you don't want to spend ages and ages doing planning poker. I've seen teams that take a whole day to do the planning poker in a 2-week sprint, which is just stupid. We don't have the time to be talking about doing. Most of our time should be spent doing at that level. The fruit one is great fun, Vicky. It really is. It gives everybody a laugh. But I find people, if they say, if even if mentally they're thinking that's a day, oh sorry, that's a point. No, you're not allowed to mention points. You just mustn't mention them. You can mention points, but you can't mention man hours or man days because it doesn't equate. And what's interesting is if you get people estimating in bananas, they are so casual and they laugh such a lot about it, and their estimates are better because they're not thinking, oh, does that feel like a day, or oh, does that feel like an hour? They just go, oh, it's at least 3 bananas. And funnily enough, being relaxed about estimating, they're just as good as agonizing over it. We've proved this over many years. The more you stress about it, quite often the worse it gets. So I'm looking forward to a barrage of fruit in all your projects now, and people will think you're completely mad. So you can tell them it's my fault, but it does work.
We do have one more person typing.
That's Carl. Will I be able to see the chat later?
Of course,
Seb,
I can always
so
send
I
it to
yeah,
you.
and
Yeah.
then I can have a look at any questions that moved before I could read them because I've only got a little chat window here. Oh, no, different one. Carl's still typing. Yep, I should do. And also get some coloured baseball caps. If you've not seen it, you've got De Bono's Thinking Hats. It's very similar. So you have a black hat and a sort of bright pink cheerful hat. And you say, okay, today you're wearing the pink cheerful hat. Try not to be so pessimistic. But sometimes, as I say, in my experience, usually my testers give the best estimates when we're doing group estimating because they think more deeply, and they've probably been burnt more in the past. Yeah, it does work, the pessimistic and optimistic estimators. And getting people to know themselves is the good thing about Agile. You learn because you're getting the feedback, and that should mean that you gradually start to do things better. And of course, if you do buy fruit for your estimating session, you're helping the planet and helping people eat healthily as well. So you might end up estimating with banana skins if they're hungry, but the concept's there.
Okay, thank you. If we don't have any more questions, I am going to end the session. But if you do have any questions, you can always email me and I will forward it over to Barbara. I'm sure she'll be more than happy to answer them.
As best I can.
Yeah.
As long as it's not asking me to do your homework for your university thesis or something, which I have had occasionally. Could you just
Wow.
explain? Yes, no, not really. But no, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah,
And I'm
thank
looking forward to hearing something I haven't heard before. A problem I haven't heard before would be nice as well. Sadly, it's people go through the same experiences and they don't realise everybody is going
you.
through this.
So thank you so much everyone for joining. Just a
Yes, thank you.
reminder, next week you will receive the recordings. In the meantime, again, if you do have any questions about Barbara's course, Barbara's webinar, or even our courses, you can always email us. Thank you, Barbara, very helpful. Getting very good feedback there.
That's good.
A few people are typing. Just going to wait for them.
Okay. I saw somebody was very unhappy, but it's difficult to know what they came expecting. I think people that know me know exactly what they're going to get. So I'm very predictable, if nothing else, and I don't take anything seriously.
That can actually sometimes be a mistake, because sometimes when I do look, they do give positive feedback. So occasionally we do get some negative ones, but when I do look at the feedback, it's positive, so I wouldn't worry too much.
Yeah. It's always nice when you've got 4, though, because people often look for the middle one just to be safe.
Yeah. To receive the recording and slides next week. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start to end the session. So thank you so much, first Barbara, and thank you everyone else for joining. And I hope you have a nice evening. Thank you.
Yes, and a good bank holiday weekend.
Yep, bank
Those in
holiday.
the UK, and thank you
Yep.
all for coming and listening.
Yep. Thank you so much, everyone.